And I bow to God that resides in the heart of each of you. We are all but extensions of that one great consciousness. This morning we want to talk about achieving balance and harmony inwardly. And I'll skip right to the end and say that the way to do that is to achieve harmony and balance with God. And so everything else that I say is less than that, but will lead up to that and help us achieve that goal. Because when we can achieve that goal, then we come into harmony with our own true self. Our own true self is an extension of God, and we are nothing but an extension of God, and everyone else in the world is the same. And so, if that simple truth could be understood, then there would be no disharmony in life. I read a quote by the Dalai Lama recently that said, if every 8-year-old in the world were taught to meditate, war would end within a generation. And so as we become in harmony inwardly, naturally that harmony extends outwardly. When we become balanced in our own self, naturally that balance is extended outward. But also for us who are not yet at that place, there is a relationship between the outer world and the inner world, and the harmony within extends outwardly. If we create a harmonious environment around us, that also helps our inner life, but the opposite is also true. If we're disharmonious, if we're upset, if we're reactive inside, that extends outward into the world that we inhabit, and we cause reactions in other people. And if the way that we live and the choices that we make, extending our energies outward, are out of balance and disharmonious, then that affects us inwardly. So that cycle is very important, and I want to talk a little bit about that inner and outer cycle. So the most centered place, let's use the image now of a tree, perhaps a majestic pine tree with a tall trunk and branches that reach out very wide. The most centered place is in the center of that trunk. For us, our most centered place is in the center of our spine and the center of our central nervous system. And so all of the real reactions, all of the real world that we think is outside of us, we actually live inside of our own central nervous system. As you look, it looks as if I'm at a distance, and I look and I see that you're at a distance. But what is really happening for both of us is that sight is happening on the surface of our eyeballs and then on the nerve system that's inside the eyeball. So what seems to be outside of us and what it looks like I'm seeing out there is really only the reflected light that has bounced off a person, a wall, a ceiling, and that light comes back and we're seeing it actually inside of ourselves, inside of our brain. So light is outside, but the seeing is inside, and so with all of our senses. But the more we extend those senses outward, the more we think that we live outside of ourselves, the more like that pine tree, we extend out in the branches, and those branches are not necessarily in balance, and especially if that tree has grown, let's say lacking sunlight from one direction, receiving it only from the other direction, those branches are going to be predominantly on one side or another. And so if you live your life out of balance and you open yourself to the light of God only from one direction, let's call that direction success, worldly success. If you open yourself only to the light that comes through worldly success, you're not interested in anything else, you don't care what happens, other than success, you don't care how you treat people in order to achieve success, then your tree is going to grow in a very unbalanced way. All of your branches are going to reach out in one direction, and they're going to unbalance you on the inside. And so for us, we need to bring our energy back in. And let me talk about that. There are ways to do that on physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels. And so let me talk a little about that. You know, the great yogis sometimes carry a danda. And why do they carry a danda? Not because they can't walk. Master, when we say master, we refer to Paramahansa Yoganandaji. He sometimes would carry a cane, even when he was younger, not because he needed a cane, but because that was, in America, his substitute for carrying a danda. I mean, he was strange enough already. Indian, long hair, sometimes dressed in Indian clothing and the orange Geru robes and so on. He was strange enough already. He didn't need a danda as he walked around, so he would carry a cane. But the cane was a substitute for a danda. Now, why does a yogi sometimes carry a danda? Master said because it represents the spine. And if we live in our spine, if we live in our central being, then we live in balance and we live in harmony. As we get more extended outside of that, we become less and less balanced. And not only do we become less and less balanced, we become, if we stretch out on two sides, those sides represent duality. So as we stretch out, one represents elation. Oh, isn't this exciting? Isn't this wonderful? I went to work. I got a job promotion. It's just wonderful. And so we're all elated, and our emotions are all riled up. And then we hear the next day, oh, we didn't get that promotion after all. Oh, now I'm all depressed. I'm all run down. Is life even worth living? And so the more extended outside of ourselves, the more we live in a world of duality, and the more we live out of balance. The more we can bring our energy in, the more we live in a state of balance. When I was a child, there was a park near us, and the park had a little wheel, and the children would sit on that wheel, and then someone would push that wheel, spin it around. And if you were on the outer edge of that wheel, you had to hold on to something or you'd fly off. And of course, flying off was more fun, so we didn't hold on to anything. We loved to fly off. But then we would have contests where the last one to fly off was the winner. And so we quickly learned that the place that you didn't fly off was when you got to the center of that wheel. And then you barely had to hold on at all. And so there'd be a battle to get to the center. Well, if only the rest of us would battle to get to our own centers, this world would change. So how do we get our energy centered? Our energy tends to go outside of ourselves. Let me talk first a little bit about on a physical plane. What can we do to help bring our energy in? Krishna in Gita tells Arjuna, yoga is not for he who eats too much or eats too little, for he who sleeps too much or sleeps too little. And so the first thing is to not get too much into extremes. And physically, what that means is Master put a lot of emphasis on diet, not just diet that would make us healthy, but diet that would help uplift our consciousness. In fact, the very first day that I met Swamiji, I was a young man of 23, and I had read the autobiography of a yogi, and as Dr. Aditya said, I went and I knocked on the door in San Francisco of Swami Kriyananda's apartment, and he introduced himself, and we introduced ourselves. And then he said, I'm working on a project. Would you like to help? He was actually sending out flyers for his upcoming classes, and we were putting mailing addresses on that. After that, we went out to this beautiful spot in San Francisco, Golden Gate Park, and we had a picnic. It was wonderful. That's what really hooked me. Ananda Moy Ma said, once the cobra bites and that poison gets in you, it never gets out again. And I got bitten by the cobra that day because I was very interested. I had read the autobiography of a yogi, and I wanted to know more about it. And here was a direct disciple, and not just any direct disciple, the direct disciple that had absorbed so much of the teachings and was doing so much to help others absorb those teachings. And so Swami Kriyananda, we started out with some songs. He had a wonderful voice, and he brought a guitar and he played some songs and sang those songs, and it was charming. And then as we ate the food for the picnic, he began to say that those foods not only had different nutrients, they had different qualities. There's food that helps us be harmonious. That's sattvic food. There's foods that make us restless. That's rajasic foods. And there are foods that make us sleepy and heavy and pull our energy down. Those are tamasic foods. And so he started talking about quality of foods, but also specific qualities that Master had taught him. Bananas, for instance, are for humility. Cherries are for joy. They bring that quality to one. And there's a popular song that used to be popular in America, life is just a bowl of cherries. And it's true, because cherries help bring the quality of joy to us. So the foods we eat help bring us into a state of centeredness and balance, or they take us out of that state of balance. And one of the things that we first learn to control is our diet. Now, I won't go into, there are a million pages of diet information and suggestions on the internet or in the bookstore. You can get all of that information you want, but unfortunately, some of it is conflicting with each other. Let me tell you what Master said about diet. He called it proper eatarianism. So proper eatarianism is the majority of your diet should be fresh fruits and vegetables. You should have whole grains, and you should have those kinds of elements in your diet that help uplift your consciousness. And he suggested that you fast 1 day a week if you can. Now, why fast 1 day a week? I mean, this was back in the 1920s and 1930s that he was suggesting this in America, and it was probably no more popular to suggest that in America in 1920 than it is today to suggest that you fast a day a week. But now studies are coming out for what fasting does for you if you fast 1 day a week. It resets your cellular system, resets your hormonal system. It helps cure diabetes. There are hundreds of benefits of periodic fasting. But I don't want to dwell on just that, because honestly, the physical world, if we get that under our control, is the least important of the 4 elements. But eat properly, and if you eat properly, your system, your physical system, is going to be more harmonious. And you'll find it easier to meditate, you'll find it easier to stay centered, and you'll find it easier to be non-reactive to the things that come to you. So the physical has an influence, but it isn't as powerful as some of the other aspects. I'll just touch on 2 other aspects physically. One, try to get some exercise. Yogananda Ji taught the energization exercises, where you tense and relax various parts of your body. That not only keeps the body strong, but it isn't just calisthenics. It also teaches you to control the flow of life force or of prana. And so you can send that and withdraw that. And ultimately, if you can control prana, you will be able to control your mind. But let me come to that step by step. So control the physical aspects of your life, being able to have proper diet, proper exercise, enough sleep, but not too much sleep. He who sleeps too little, he who sleeps too much. Have enough, but not too much. And don't take substance into your body that are toxic. Alcohol, smoking, any kinds of drugs, those things just pollute the body. It's like that pine tree that I expressed earlier. You know, the nutrients and life force come in through the trees and through the trunk and the root system. And if that tree is in a toxic environment in the air or a toxic environment in the earth, that tree dies. We one time drove a long stretch through East Germany at the time that they were heating with coal for years and years and years. And we looked, and there were vast forests, stretches of completely dead trees. And it just looked like we were driving through a barren land. And so if mankind keeps polluting the environment the way we're doing, we're going to end up with vast stretches like that. But that's not the subject of this talk. So control those things physically that you can. More important is the control of your energy. And so you can control your energy by these energization exercises that we have taught. And if you don't know them, then they're available at our center here. And they're marvelous. Swami Kriyananda did those every day without fail. And even into his 80s, even though he had a lot of karmic tests and was taking on karma, had many, many physical things that he was dealing with, still his legs were rock hard at the age of 87 because he religiously did those energization exercises. And so controlling the energy, Master teaches that we're surrounded by prana. It isn't just Master, all the great yogis teach this. We're surrounded by a sea of energy, and that energy actually enters at the stage, at the point of the medulla in the body. It isn't the physical medulla, it's just that area, that it's the subtle spine and the chakras. And energy, prana, enters into the physical body at that point. And if we can learn to control how that prana is directed, we will learn to control also our mental state. And so if we control our energy, we will control our mind and emotions, but it also works in reverse. And so Master also taught a lot of affirmations, because if your mind is positive, then you're open to that flow of energy, and you're open to all of the other beneficial elements that can come to you. So positive thinking and positive acting is not something that is, I don't know, kind of a, people can laugh at it. People can say, oh, it's just kind of airy-fairy and it's not really important. They've done studies showing that those who are happy, those who act with positive energy, are more successful in every aspect of life. So Yoganandaji taught affirmations in order to control that. And he also taught visualization in order to have the mind able to control, able to picture positive things. If you would have an affirmation or a visualization maybe once every 2 hours to uplift the mind, it would be like taking a drink of refreshing prana every 2 hours. And it will change your whole attitude, your whole behavior. So those are powerful techniques, but the most powerful of all is meditation, because meditation brings us back in balance inside. meditation actually, I was talking about prana and sending that prana out to the various aspects of our body by tension and relaxation, but consciously sending energy. Where do we want to bring that energy to? Back into the spine, back into the trunk of our tree, which is the central nervous system. And so as we withdraw that energy, then the duality of the world, the likes and dislikes, the ups and downs, the night and day, the pleasure and pain, all of that begins to fade away, and we find centered in our own self not only a steadiness and a harmony and a balance, but most of all, we find our own soul nature. And our own soul nature has qualities like love and joy and calmness and peace. And so, and light and sound and other qualities or aspects of God. When we find that residing within ourselves, then we're really in balance. So diet helps a little, exercise helps a little, all those outer things help a little. But what really helps is meditation and bringing our energy back within ourselves. And when we do that and can lift the energy up to the higher centers, especially the Kutastha, then in that state of consciousness, we are completely centered. Yogananda said we should be even-minded and cheerful in all circumstances. Well, until you have your energy under control, until you have your consciousness under control, you can't be even-minded and happy under all circumstances, because you're reacting plus, minus, up and down, and you begin to lose control. As Gita teaches, that when we have desires, some of those desires get frustrated. And when the desire gets frustrated, anger arises. And when anger arises, then lack of discrimination follows from that. And with lack of discrimination, the individual or the whole society begins to fall down. And so that process is very, very important to us, because non-attachment, non-having too many desires, or simplifying our life keeps us from getting caught up in that process all the time. So the more desires you have, the more you're going to end up frustrated and angry and lacking discrimination, which brings me to the second thing that I want to talk about: how to make the right choices in life. There's a kind of a joke about this young man who comes to a wise older man, and the younger man says, "How are you able to make such good choices in life?" And the older man says, "Well, good choices are born of experience." And the younger man says, "Well, how do I get that experience?" And the older man says, "Bad choices." And so, as we make bad choices in life, we learn that pain is the result of that. That unbalance, unrest is the result of that. And so, trying to make good choices requires discrimination. You know, our minds work on the basis of logic, and they work on the basis of problem consciousness. Oh, here's a problem, there's another problem over there, and let's make long lists, and we can figure out which problem we should prioritize and how to make. And yes, that works to a certain extent, but it doesn't bring us into a state of inner balance, really. Inner balance and wise choices come from intuition. Master said that logic is the mind's way of knowing. Intuition is our soul's way of knowing. And how do we awaken intuition? First of all, with non-attachment. Remember that kind of sequence. With desire comes frustration, With frustration comes anger and loss of discrimination. So the more we reach out and hope that we're satisfied, hope that something outside of us will produce happiness for us, the less balance and the less control we have. And so intuition bypasses all that problem consciousness, and it goes directly to the answer. And when we can live in a balance inwardly, then we also affect our outer life, and our outer life affects us. And let me end by talking about that. First of all, how does our outer life affect our inner life? Well, if you want to be restless, then associate with restless people and listen to restless music and watch restless things on the television and check your mobile every 10 minutes to see whether there's a message. And then if there is a message, try to multitask on your mobile. And the more things that you do that make you nervous, the more outside of yourself and out of balance you're going to be. One time a man came to Yogananda and he said, I've been having a difficulty with my heart. And Yogananda gave him the strangest piece of advice. He said, have your wife cut off the middle button of your vest. And the man, why? What? And Yogananda noticed that this man had a habit of playing with that middle button. And it produced nervousness in his mind, and that nervousness translated into irregularity in his heart. And so the outer world, if we connect nervously with it, will create inner nervousness with you, and then it's a downward spiral from there. So you have the ability to control your outer environment. One time, a student of Swami Kriyananda's went to him and she was trying to get the answer to a problem that she was having. And she said, oh, Swami, it's so hard to know what to do. And Swami said, no, it isn't. You already know what to do. It isn't hard to know what to do. You're just having trouble doing what you know that you should do. So all of you in the audience, you know the things that are making you restless, and you know that they're not good for you. I don't need to tell you that. I can remind you of that. The difficulty is that the habit momentum isn't allowing you to change those habits. And so try to control one thing at a time. Try to control maybe the tendency to go on a mobile and check emails or messages every 10 minutes. Limit yourself. Do it once in the morning, once in the evening, or once at noon and then in the evening. But limit yourself and control your habit patterns so that you bring your energy in. Now, when you bring your energy in and you're contented and happy and balanced in your own self, then you begin to influence the environment around you. If you come to a person and you're acting grumpy and angry, and you come to a salesperson and you say, I want a cup of coffee, and fast, and make it the way I want it, how is he going to act? How is he going to make that cup of coffee for you if that's what you're after? Of course, coffee makes you nervous too, but we won't go into that. But if you're harmonious and happy, then it changes that person. One time, David G. and I were flying on the day after Thanksgiving, which is a big holiday in America. And for whatever reason, so often on big holidays, the main activity is overeating. And so it is with Thanksgiving in America. And so everybody overeats on Thanksgiving, and some drink too much, and then the next day, they're kind of like this. And so we came to the airport the day after Thanksgiving, and we went to get a cup of tea at this little coffee and tea shop. And the guy came and kind of looked at us through blurry eyes, and you could see that he was barely functioning. And so we started just trying to give him energy. And we ordered our tea, but then we said, "What did you do yesterday for Thanksgiving? Did you go and see your family?" And that perked him up a little bit. And he began to talk about, yes, he'd gone to see his family. And, well, what did you eat? Was there a big meal? Of course, then he began to describe. So his energy started to come up. And just the friendship brought his energy up. And then there were two other employees that were in the shop, and they saw this happening because they were like this too. They wanted a little hit of energy, and they came over, and we were just chatting. And at the end of 5 minutes, one of them, who lived in the Philippines, said, "If you ever come to the Philippines, you have to come and visit me with my family." Gave us her address, and we were all friends and family. Now, that is distorting the universe around you. According to your actions, you will actually bend the reality around you. And so the universe will respond to you the way that you respond to the universe. So if you're centered, if you're harmonious, if you're even-minded and cheerful, and you react to other people like that, other people will feed that back to you. And if you're a meditator, and if you have a bubble of joy around you, whenever you walk down the street, you will touch others with that bubble of joy. And it will lift their energy up and center it, because joy is centered here at the Kutastha. That's the center of joy in the body. And if your energy emanates from there, it will affect others, and it will help them withdraw their energy. I'll just end with this story. We used to go with Swami Kriyananda for several months. We were living together in Los Angeles. And there was a place where it was nice and flat, and there was a stretch of shops for about 2 blocks, and he would like to walk down and look at the pleasant things in the shops. And then we'd cross the street and come back down the other side. And it was just a way of him getting exercise that had a little interest to it, rather than just kind of walking in a neighborhood. And so one day we did this, and as we were coming back down the other side, there was a woman shopkeeper standing outside of her shop. And Swami came up and stopped and began chatting with her. And this woman was rather sensitive spiritually. And she said, "Oh, I was so hoping you would stop and come into my shop." With a lot of energy, she said it. And Swami said, "Well, why?" And she said, "I was watching you and your little group on the other side of the street, and I could see an aura of light around you, especially in the whole group. And everybody you passed, I could see that they got a little bit happier. And I was so hoping that you would come and bring that light into my shop." And of course, Swami was charmed, because this is the truth. And immediately they had a friendship. And she would come to whatever event Swami was coming, and whenever we went to walk there, he would stop in this shop and occasionally buy a little something that was pretty, because she had pretty things. But it wasn't about merchandising. It wasn't a sales energy. It was a friendship in light. And so the most balanced, the most harmonious thing we can do is to live in one of the qualities of God and to emanate that around us. So if you can live in light and emanate that around you, everything that you touch, every person that you touch, will feel that light and will respond. And if you can emanate joy, you will awaken joy in everyone you touch. And this is the way to be truly balanced and harmonious.
Hello, everyone. I'll also share some thoughts with you today. First, I also want to thank you all for joining us today, and especially thank all of our volunteers that make these events possible. You know, we all come and we see a beautiful stage, book tables, lovely altars, but there are hours and hours and days of planning that go into creating such an event where we can come together and share God's vibrations in fellowship and Sangha together. So thanks to all of you who made this possible. I read a wonderful quote quite recently, in fact yesterday, that said, "Spaceship Earth has no passengers. We are all members of the crew." And I thought that was a very good quote, because what's the difference between passengers and crew? Passengers can sit in their seat and throw things in the aisle and ask for this and ask for that and get irritated if there's a line or something. But the crew has to make it all work. And so it has to keep everything flowing, making sure everything's in balance. And so this planet that we live on, if we all thought of ourselves as the crew and not just passengers, this would be a very different world than we find right now. Right now, our world is very much out of balance. We can see it in the environment. We can see the global warming and the melting of the polar ice caps and the glaciers. We can see it in the level of pollution. Jyotishji and I have rooms in our ashram in Gurgaon. And I don't know why God put us in the most polluted city in the world, but there we are. And you just wake up in the morning and the air is quite polluted. And we see the rise more and more frequently of these epidemics, pandemics that span the planet, and diseases that we don't yet have cures for. And the instability of global economics, the hostility, the imbalance in disharmony between different religions. What is causing all of this? Are these random events? Not at all. Yoganandaji said that it is the consciousness of humanity that creates the environment around us, just as Jyotishji was saying. So it's the consciousness of indifference to the world around us that allows such levels of pollution to exist. It is the consciousness of greed and seeking only for oneself that creates financial instability. It is the consciousness of lack of sensitivity to the natural environment that creates the weather patterns that we see that are changing dramatically in our lifetime. The state of California, where Ananda Village is, we've been in a drought for 7 years, and the reservoirs are going down and down and down, and they're having to stop bringing water to big stretches of farmland and orchards because it simply doesn't exist. The water is not available, and they're trying to kind of not alarm the general public, but we're getting close to having to do water rationing. What's causing all this? It's man's inability to work cooperatively with nature or with each other. We were traveling in Mexico with a group of Ananda school children a few years ago. They were going to do service in an orphanage in southern Mexico. And as we would drive, there would be a big populated area, and then you'd see these huge stretches of golf course, lawns and beautiful. And my mind was just thinking how much water that must take to sustain that. Then you go a little further out, there's the golf course where it ends, and then there's just the shacks where the people live. And I thought, what is wrong with this? Can't people see the imbalance here? Can't people see that here's people who don't have enough water to have a little garden plot outside their very humble shed, and here's people playing golf on these manicured putting greens? What's wrong with that? And so as a planet now, as a global community, we need to stop being crew passengers and start being crew members. And how does that happen? Well, I want to tell you a little story about one of the wisest, bravest people that I have met in my life. Her name was Maria, and she was born in Russia. She and her sister, they were Russian Jews, and their parents died when they were quite young. They were left orphans in their teens. But somehow or another, they had the courage to make their way out of Russia. They lied and said they had relatives in Israel, and they were given visas to leave. They had no one in the world to care for them. They made it to Israel, but they kept going. Then they made it, they wanted to come to the United States. They made it to Europe, just earning money as they can, learning the languages they could. And they were sitting on a park bench in Paris, France, and a man came up to them and said, "Here, I think you should read this." Do you know what book it was? Autobiography of a Yogi. They read that book. They made their way to New York. And in New York, there was they saw a poster, Teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. They went there, and they met members of Ananda giving a lecture, just as we are giving a lecture to you. And they came out, and they joined Ananda. And after living there about 10 years, Maria married, some of you have met Nayaswami Devarshi, this was his wife. And they married, but then Maria was diagnosed in her 30s with advanced cancer. And she fought it she had surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, it would be in remission, but for 10 years this went on. And then finally, Devarshi and Maria were giving some programs in Dallas, Texas, and she began having an incapacitating headache. And she simply said, "It's gone into my brain." And by the time they returned to Ananda Village a few days later, she could no longer walk. It was growing very quickly. And as Devarshi was wheeling her into the medical facility where she was going to have an MRI, which in fact determined that her brain was filled with tumors, and Devarshi was quite upset, one naturally, understandably. And Maria looked up at him, and she gave us what we call Maria's mantra. She just looked up at him, and she passed a few months later in a state of freedom. Maria looked up at Devarshi, and she gave us her mantra. She said, "Detach yourself, control the reactive process, and live the teachings." And that's all she said. And shortly after that, she really went into a state of silence. We were with her at the end when she died, very peacefully. But I want to talk about Maria's mantra, because we made big posters of it, we shared it. But these three injunctions that Maria gave, detach yourself, control the reactive process, and live the teachings, are really the essence of the spiritual life. And they're the essence of what enables us to live in harmony within ourselves, with others, and to create harmony on the planet. I should add also, Yoganandaji predicted that the world would go through tremendous upheaval environmentally, financially, politically, all of these things. But he said these future events are not carved in stone. They can be ameliorated if the consciousness of the majority of the planet can change, can learn to live in harmony, can learn to cooperate and appreciate the natural world around us. And so, in a sense, this talk today, how to live in harmony and balance, it's not just a pleasant spiritual topic. It's vital to the survival of our planet and to the happiness and the future of mankind. And so let's talk about Maria's mantra. First of all, detach yourself. How do we do that? Because life seems to be so real to us. It seems so important. And so said something and we're devastated and we have to change it and give them back what they gave to us. But if we can begin to just step back one step, there's a simple bit of advice. If you get angry, count to 10 before you say anything. It works. Even in those 10 seconds, you're able to get that control where you don't just say, this is real and I'm engaged in it. One of my favorite stories from the scriptures of India is the story of when Narada and Vishnu were going for a walk one day. They were just wandering the countryside. And Narada, the disciple, says to the Guru, Vishnu, he said, Master, explain to me the nature of delusion, of Maya. And Vishnu says, very well, but I'm a little bit thirsty. I see a village over in the distance. Could you go and get me a drink of water? And Narada says, willingly, Master. And he runs off to the village to get some water. And he knocks on the first cottage that he comes to, and the door opens. And lo and behold, there's a beautiful young maiden, the most beautiful girl that Narada had ever seen. And he immediately falls in love with her. Desires, frustration, anger, as we were talking about. And he says, he thinks, I must have this girl for my wife. And of course, Vishnu over and outside the village is quickly forgotten. And he asked the girl, will you take me as your husband? And she said, well, you must ask my father. He's the head man of the village. So he goes to the father and he asks, and the head man said, well, you seem like a fine young man, but I'm the head man and I have no sons. So if I give you permission to marry my daughter, you must stay in the village and become the head man yourself. And Narada is willing to do anything. So yes. And so they're married, and time goes by, and a son is born, and time goes by, and the father dies, and Narada is the head man of the village, and years go by, and another child, and a third child is born. And then one day, the rains began coming. Not quite like the rains today, but they begin coming. And the river starts rising, and then it starts overflowing its banks. And finally, the river begins flooding the village, and the huts, the little cottages, are being washed away. And Narada, in fleeing for his life with his family, he grabs one child with one hand and his wife with the other hand. She has the third child. He puts the second child, he puts the third child on his shoulders, and they're trying to make their way through this incredible rushing water, fleeing for their life. And finally, Narada stumbles and he releases, and one of the children gets washed away. And then the wife can't hold on to the second child, and that child gets washed away. And then Narada and his wife lose their grip on each other's hands, and she's washed away. And finally, Narada stumbles full into the water, and the third child is washed away. And he just gives himself up into the river of despair. And after some time, he hears someone calling his name, Narada, Narada, and he opens his eyes, and there's Vishnu. And he says, Narada, I sent you 10 minutes ago to the village to get me a drink of water, and now I find you sleeping on the sand. What has happened? And Narada touches his guru's feet, and he said, now I understand the nature of Maya. It seems so real. It seems so gripping to us. But we need to always be detached. Whatever happens, remember that this is not real. It's only God's dream. And then if we detach ourselves, then to control the reactive process. You know, in the great Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the second sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Narod. Yoga is the neutralization of the vortices of feeling. So once we begin to detach ourselves, then we're not so engaged with, we can be more harmonious because our ego is not pitted against the egos all around us. It doesn't matter so much. And if we can control the reactive process, we can live in harmony. I remember some years ago, there was a man who was very critical of Swami Kriyananda. He was always saying, Swami did this wrong and Swami did that wrong, and he's not a good leader. And in fact, this man said, I would be a better leader, and on and on and on, but always, always critical. And one time there was a gathering, and this man was standing over the side looking very critically at Swamiji. And Swamiji didn't react. He didn't say, why are you acting the way? He just simply went up, took the man's hands and said, I could be the devil himself, but it's not your problem. Why don't you live in joy? And that's all he said. The man left. I don't know that he really had the expansion of consciousness to accept that. But nevertheless, Swami's example of not reacting to that critic, not saying, not having to get into the conflict with him, but just to remain in a non-reactive state. I think for me, being part of the Ananda community, since really most of my life, all of my adult life, I think this is the thing that I find the most inspiring. I have a friend now who lives there, and her husband is dying of a rare disease that there's nothing really that can be done. But you look in both of their eyes, and there's nothing but peace and calmness. And I searched their eyes, and we went to visit them shortly before we left to come to India. And we sat with them, and I thought, they are at peace. They are not reacting. They are just accepting in a state of equanimity whatever is happening. And then finally, the last part of Maria's mantra, live the teachings. What does that mean? How do we live the teachings? What are the teachings? Well, just as Jyotish said, it's not a mystery. To live righteously. In the West, we have the 10 Commandments. In India, we have the yamas and niyamas, the basic principles of moral behavior. Non-violence, non-lying, non-stealing, non-sensuality, non-greed, cleanliness, contentment, tapasya, self-study, devotion. These are the pillars of life. When we live this way, the world provides us everything we want. And in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he says the power that is accrued from perfecting each of these yamas and niyamas. If we live with a sense of non-greed, everything that we need will come to us on a material level. If we live in a sense of nonviolence, the world around us becomes peaceful and harmonious, and on and on. So the basic fundamentals of human life, they can't be ignored. Without them, you can go and meditate all you like. You can do mantras and chanting, but if you're not honest, if you're not kind, if you're living a life of intense sensuality, you won't be able to do these things. You won't be able to have an interior balanced life. So one aspect is living the basic moral precepts, when we say living the teachings. Another aspect, Yoganandaji said that our path is a balanced life of meditation and service. Find a way to serve humanity in whatever way it can be, not just your family. That's our duty. But we have a bigger duty, and that's to humanity at large, to find a way that we can make a difference in the world. Why did Jyotishji and I talk to that little man at the tea shop? Simply to try to share with him the joy we were feeling from a life of meditation. It was just service. And we can do that in many, many ways, to live in harmony, give what you have. We heard a talk, a recorded talk of Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and when there was a big famine in the area, and she and her nuns were distributing rice to the people that were starving. And she brought some rice, not a large quantity, gave it to one household, to the mother there. Immediately, the mother took it and divided it in half and wrapped the packet up. And the nun said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "Oh, I know a family more in need than we are." So to see a light, if ever, this is really a maxim. If there's any area of your life where you are unhappy, for whatever reason, find someone else to help. And in that service of others, you forget your own any problems that you have, and you return once more to your natural state of joy. And finally, living the teachings, have an inner life. Practice meditation. We were speaking with someone yesterday, and they said, "Oh, I have a hard time finding the time to meditate." Don't we all? But Jyotish said something, it's so wonderful sharing your life with a teacher, because every day you learn something. Jyotishji said something so wise to this woman. He said, meditation is what feeds our inner nervous system, our spine and our brain and our chakras and the spiritual eye. He said, food feeds the body, but meditation feeds the soul. And without doing that every day, the soul becomes hungry, the soul becomes diminished. And you see people, young people, that their light is gone. And you see people, I see some of them sitting in the front row here, whose lives have been dedicated to loving God, loving Divine Mother, and age does not diminish them, but only they become more radiant with the inner light. So, to find balance and harmony within. It is not, as we said, it is not just for ourselves. This is really an extremely important aspect of the world today. Why, as a Westerner, we look at your Prime Minister Modi. You can debate it with me, I don't know, but in the West we're very impressed with him. And why is he such an impressive man? He has led a life of integrity, self-discipline, sadhana, service to others. And if we can do that, all of us, think of this crew of Spaceship Earth saying we are steering our world into a new age of prosperity for all, harmony with nature, well-being throughout the planet, and Mother Nature, Divine Mother, Kali Devi, smiling on us all and saying, my children, you have finally understood. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Jyotish and Devi, for sharing your wisdom and understanding with all of us. We will dearly remember the pine tree and remember to balance it from time to time, as well as the story of Narada and Maria's mantra, which really stood out for all of us. Thank you so much. We now have an opportunity to ask them a few questions, and we will have mics circulated by Deepak and Suvir. So just raise your hand if you feel to ask a question. So Deepak, there's a question there.
You talk about detachment, but how is it possible to be detached? Because attachment gets your work done. I mean, attachment is very life force, which propels my living. I mean, if I'm not attached to my job, if I'm not attached to my work, I won't make a living. So how do you say that you should be detached?
Very good question.
Okay, it's a very good question. You're not the first one to ask that. In fact, Arjuna asked Krishna that very same question. If we're not attached to what we do, what motivates us to do anything? And so, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the difficulty of attachment. When we are attached to something, we create the condition that says, unless I achieve this goal, then I will be unhappy. So the problem is not in trying to achieve the goal. The problem is in placing our happiness or unhappiness in the achievement of that goal. And so if we can bring back the sense that achieving this goal is going to make me happy, and not achieving this goal is going to make me miserable, then that is the essence of Nishkam Karma that is taught in Gita. To act without desire for the fruits of action. So the attachment doesn't force us to act. We can choose to act, but the attachment outwardly makes us subject to being happy or unhappy according to the fruits of that. Whereas we can pull that energy back. Now, Davidji and I I'm not going to say how old we are, but we're still extremely active. But we aren't attached to achieving something where our happiness isn't caught up in that outer thing, but we're still very motivated to act. But that action is now more for us to please Guru, just to act according to what is right to do. And so we're more motivated by that than we would be by attachment to the fruits of the action. And so the more centered you are, you don't lose your motivation to act. You actually increase your motivation to act, but you lose the ability for something outside of yourself to make you happy or sad.
It was a very nice talk, and I would like to refer to the point that you raised about terrorism and extremism. I know it's a very sensitive topic, but I failed to see how spiritualism can help us fighting these tendencies when some religions are even fighting against the sects, SECT, sects in their religion. And principles of non-violence and reverence for the same principle that is abiding within all of us. We can't even express these things. We can't even communicate these things to such people. So what is the solution? Is the solution only political? Is the solution only of military prowess? Or can spiritualism do something about this?
That's a very good and very pertinent question. Do you want to? Okay. It's about, I'll start.
Okay, I couldn't
Yeah,
quite hear
quite.
everything. you said.
It's about terrorism and how to battle against that, and can spirituality be effective against that. First of all, terrorism is a cancer in society. It's a terrible thing, and that consciousness of terrorism is one of the worst spiritual diseases that we have on the planet at this time. There are many rationales for it. People say, oh, it's okay because they're downtrodden, they're depressed, are pushed down in society. None of it. There's no rationale for terrorism. So can spirituality fight against that incorrect behavior? Probably for the people who are caught up in it at this time, I would say they are not reachable on a rational basis. And so in the Gita, again, the war of Kurukshetra is very clear about when there is evil in society that is pulling society down, you must combat that with force. So for terrorism, because we can't reach those people on a rational basis, we can't persuade them to change their ways by any spiritual lecture that we might give, then we have to use force against that. But let me also talk about the Gita is not only a historical document, it is allegorical. And that real battle is within ourselves. And so the real battle for this world is against the tendency toward violence. And those terrorists are only the extreme example of those willing to do violence. But is Bollywood, is Hollywood able to do violence? Are they making movies? Are there television programs? Are there books and media and all of that that is focused on violence? Is that not also feeding this tendency to do violence? So to a certain extent, we have to take force against the terrorists, but the disease also operates within us. The disease of hatred, the disease of reaction, if that resides within our hearts, then we're part of the problem. And our primary job is to clean up our own act. And when we clean up our own act, then we can start cleaning up the world around us. But if we only combat terrorism outwardly and have the thoughts of violence and anger within ourselves, we pollute the atmosphere, the mental and spiritual atmosphere of the planets. So we have to work on both sides simultaneously, but we can't work only outwardly and expect it really to change. We can't work only inwardly and reach those people because they're not ready to be reached on that level. And so both simultaneously have to happen.
I would also like to add, and then we'll take some more questions, because this is it's a question that it troubles all of us. Every day when you hear about some new act, the heart is hurt by this. We saw a documentary film a few years ago called Return with Honor, and it was footage, interviews with American airplane pilots who had been, this during the Vietnamese War, who had, their planes had been shot down, and they had been taken to a prison camp, really a torture camp. They called it the Hanoi Hilton in Hanoi. And these were interviews with the men who had survived. And all of them who survived had deep faith in God. I think that's what got them through it. And one man told a remarkable story. He said there was one guard who was especially sadistic, and he would, every day for years, he would bring that man into this torture room and torture him in different ways. Several years went by, unceasingly. But this man had deep faith. He was a Christian. He had deep faith in God, and he would pray, and he would pray, and he would inwardly think of Jesus, and he would recite passages from the Bible. And then finally, he was so beaten down, and he was so exhausted, he said, Lord, I have no strength left. You have to take over. And in that moment, he felt this wave of grace and love and light just surround him. And he looked at this man who had been torturing him unceasingly for years, and he said, don't you know there's nothing you can do to hurt me? And the man he felt that spiritual power, and he just backed out of the room, and he would never go near that man again, the prisoner. The guard would never go back near that prisoner again. So what does this story illustrate? The power of God flowing through us. The prisoner didn't have the ability to fight the guard, to make political protest, any of that. All he had, just as Gandhiji. How did Gandhiji throw the British out? Soul force. And when you read in the scriptures, Mahabharata and Ramayana, how the world was filled with demons. The Rakshasas had taken over. And the great incarnations, Rama and Krishna, came, and the Pandavas, to destroy the Rakshasas, drive them out. Our earth now is populated with Rakshasas. That's what these people are. They've given up their soul. They're dark. They're influenced by the darkness. And so all we can do is fight it with light. Every day, send out that light. And that, it says in the Christian Bible, there's a light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness understands it not. That's the light of God. That the more we all can believe in that light, dwell in that light, share that light, project that light, the cancer of terrorism will begin to be irradiated and will begin to leave the body of this planet.
Thank you, Grace. Do we have any more questions?
There's one
Yeah,
here.
there's one at the back.
You told us Maria's mantra, which I feel that it will help us finding harmony. It will help us finding harmony and inner happiness. There are 3 segments, as you told us: detachment, reaction, and living the teaching. So can you help us understand more about reactions, because we are living in the normal real world and we all are normal human beings.
Okay, talk about the reactive process.
First
You-
of all, no, you start. I just want to say we're not living in the real world.
Right? Talking about the reactive process, we could have a month-long seminar just on that alone. The reactive process begins in our own self. It begins by the flow of energy up or down in our central nervous system, and especially in our astral spine. The astral spine, the chakras, these teachings are part of yoga, and I won't go into them other than to mention that that's where it begins. But when because you can find information at our center. But when the energy is flowing up, especially toward the higher centers, the consciousness becomes positive and centered. When the energy is flowing down, it becomes negative and more outward. And you can see this even in body language. When someone says, "I don't feel good, I'm depressed," you never see somebody saying, "I don't feel good, I'm depressed." Or someone saying, "I feel so awful, I just can't even get up in the morning." So our own body language reflects this downward pulling energy and upward pulling energy. Why do we say we get up in the morning? Because when we awake from the subconscious state, the energy rises, and so we get up in the morning. And so it begins with the body, and there are yoga postures, there are a number of things that we can do, even our diet, as I was talking about, that help to bring under control the flow of energy in our bodies. Now, when we begin to control the flow of energy in our body, then we can begin to meditate more deeply. And the purpose of meditation is to take control of that energy that goes up and down, which causes the reactive process. And under our own control, we bring it and hold it at the spiritual eye, or at the katusta. And when we can do that, we go into a state of calmness and self-control. Automatically, it isn't something we have to force. We control our mind, we control our energy, we control our reactive process. And so yoga and meditation specifically help us work on doing that. But we can't control it outwardly, because when it's just going outwardly, then it's subject to the plus and minus, the duality of Maya.
I'll just add, and then where's Dr. Jita? Maybe this is the last question. Yeah. So we'll just, I'll answer your question also, and then I think that's all the time we have questions. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Master says, thoughts are not individually rooted, but universally rooted. And what that means is we think we're thinking our own thoughts, but really even the thoughts we have, the reactions we have, are a reflection of the level of our own energy and our own consciousness. So if you are in an uplifted state, you look at the world around you, the good and the bad, and you say, well, that's just the way things are. If you are in a discouraged or negative state, you look at the world around you, this is terrible, and this is terrible, and why did they do this? And a master said, we're much more like radio receiving stations than we realize. We're just tuning into universal thought forms. So how to get out of the reactive process? Practice yoga and meditation. And that automatically helps you to get control of the upward flowing energy, to center it at the third eye, the spiritual eye. And when you do that, the whole world looks differently. Honestly, I'm not saying this. Swami Kriyananda used to always say, I don't want to convert you to anything but your own higher self. But most people miss this wonderful opportunity to see the world with the eyes of higher vision. And that's the fruit of the practice of meditation. It says in the Gita, even a little practice of this inward religion, meaning meditation and yoga, will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings. And it's true. Okay, Doctor.
Okay, I was just going to add one final little thought, that there are breathing techniques that you can use in the moment to control the reactive process, because the breath is also related to this upward and downward movement. And these are taught at our center, and so there are many techniques that actually work on this, so it isn't just vague.